So what you see in front of you is a 1974 MG Midget door. This is a project for my auto restoration, and I've been working through the process of putting this car back together after stripping it all the way down. One of the big challenges a lot of people face is with the removal of the window regulator unit as well as the installation. So what I decided to do after I stumbled upon a couple of tricks that makes it a lot easier is to do a video about this. So the first thing that you'll notice is that you have a total of 8 bolts that secure the door window regulator unit to the door. They are 1/4 inch by 28 thread pitch and no more than a 1/2 inch long. You don't want to have anything that's longer than that, otherwise it'll interfere with the mechanism as it is being operated. So the easiest part is to go ahead and remove the bolts and then start working the regulator unit out. I will provide a bit of a note at this point. If your window regulator unit is broken, or if the grease is dried and crusty and has basically made the regulator unit difficult to operate, this is going to be a little bit more challenging as you go through this process, simply because you have to fold the mechanism over almost like a pair of scissors, and you'll see that as I go through it. So let's get to the first part and let's take the bolts out. Now once I remove this last bolt, the entire mechanism is going to drop down towards the bottom of the door. What you can see here is that the only thing actually holding it up is the winding unit for the mechanism. What I failed to mention earlier is when you look at the way this is set up, one of the things you have to make sure is that the mechanism is in the up position. In other words, if you were to wind your windows up, this would be towards the top of the door. That's important to have done prior to removing this, otherwise it's going to make it a little bit more challenging to get it out. And this is one of the reasons why it folds over, is because of that particular position. So all we're going to do here is we're just going to push this through. And you see it drops all the way down. Now, folding it like a scissors, take this, as we pull it towards the rear of the door, this is going to come down, just like that. Then you're going to fold it up and over. Make sure that this doesn't catch here. You slide that back. And you can see where it's folded. Now, if you bring it forward, it's kind of folded down like a scissors. Once you get it to this point, you're almost unfolding it as you work its way out, and you keep sliding the mechanism back towards the door. It gets a little stuck right about here. So bring it as far back as you can. And then it comes out. Fairly simple, easy to do. I do want you to take a note of where the position is of this. This will become important there a little bit later as you put it back in. There are several holes on this side, and if you look at that, this is the only one that has 3 holes on this particular side. So you want to know where this is positioned with regards to the regulator unit, because when you put this back in, if you do not align this, it'll be harder for you to align it here. Not a big deal, I didn't do that the first time, but once this is properly renewed and re-greased, this mechanism spins, and you can spin it around till the holes line up. And we'll get to that when we go to the reinstallation process. All right, before we go into the cleanup of the window unit, I want to talk about the other components in the door, just because it's important to note before you put the entire system back together again. What you see primarily is 2 primary components. which is your vent window with your guide, and then your rear guide, which is towards the rear of the door, obviously. You could remove the window regulator without removing either one of these. I do recommend that you remove them because you will want to inspect them, primarily because you may have to go ahead and renew the vent window assembly, as I am going to do, because the rubber is kind of corroded, or not corroded, sorry, but dry rotted and shot. And the other thing that you're looking at is this particular piece right here, which is on both of them. This is your window guide. This is your felt rubber that goes in between and helps the glass slide along this position here. So in my case, this came out of the rear guides, and these were toast, so I had to replace them. This is what it looks like after it's replaced. It's a lot cleaner, and you don't have any problems, and it'll allow the window to slide easily. I was lucky with my vent, as although it's a little dirty, you can see that it's actually in fairly decent condition. Therefore, I did not have to replace this. And I can just clean it up and go ahead and use the existing felt for the window. You can find these products, that is the felt piece, pretty much in anybody that supplies parts for the MGs. Moss Motors, Victoria British, there's a few others out there. And then also, in my case, the little gasket piece that the vent window sits on, yeah, I think that's going to be needed to be replaced. So just wanted to make sure that you took a look at these things, removed them, inspected them, made sure that they were cleaned up, and that the felt where the window slides were clean and serviceable, so that you didn't have any problems after you reinstalled everything. Okay, so here we have the window regulator. It's out of the door. And what you'll probably notice on the window regulator is the way it sits is the way it sits in the door. Again, as you can see, this piece here is what connects to the window when you install it. See where it has a spring here and a spring here. Notice the position of the coil spring and the window regulator handle attachment. They're up this way because that's how it fits into the door, and that's what you want to make sure that this is set up when you go to put it in the door on either side. The other things that I wanted to point out is what I have here is what I use to help clean the mechanism itself. You notice I got screwdrivers and picks. These are primarily to scrape off the old gunked up grease that builds up over time and sometimes hardens, and that's commonly what causes the problem with the window regulator, where it doesn't want to roll down or roll up very easily, is not because it doesn't have grease, but because it is a 40-year-old plus car. The grease is hardened and it prevents it from moving properly. The grease that I used when I re-greased it is just straight lithium EP grease, and this is multi-purpose. You'll hear a lot of people say, hey, you should always use the white lithium grease. This works perfectly fine. What you will see usually, and let me kind of come in here, is here. This is some of the old white lithium grease that has caked up and I didn't quite get off a little bit. So as we look at this particular unit, there are some points that you're going to have to focus on when you are going through the process of cleaning this all up. So let's talk about the areas that you definitely need to clean and grease. So we looked at this piece here earlier on the tops. This has to get cleaned. It'll probably have some cake grease. Any point that moves or pivots, like these here, as well as this component here, this connection, and then your connection here, and of course your actual mechanism and your sprocket. They all need to be cleaned up and greased. You'll find that you have a heavy buildup of the old white lithium grease that they used during that time frame that's caked up in the coil spring. That will have to get removed. What I used was a combination of brake clean, as well as I used Simple Green, a brush with nylon bristles and a brush with brass bristles, as well as the screwdriver and the picks that I use to scrape out the stuff that kind of got built up and is stuck in there. When you're going through the greasing process, it is important that you get as much grease in there as you can and you make sure that it operates smoothly. Remember, once this is reinstalled, if it is not working properly and you haven't checked it, you're going to have to take everything off to pull it all the way back out again. You want to make sure that you properly grease it so once it's installed, you don't have to mess with it again. The critical pieces that you got to make sure you grease, this piece here. As you can see, this spins. I talked about earlier, if it's not lined up properly, you're going to have to spin this around in order to line it up. And of course, this section over here, your coil and your window regulator. You notice earlier I had the handle for the window regulator. I'll show you why you use that. As you go through the process of greasing things up, let's go ahead and grab my grease here. You can put it under this way, and you're going to go in and grease through this area over here, as well as all your joints, making sure that you have plenty of grease. I've already got quite a bit of grease on this, so I'm not going to do a whole lot. But with the sprocket, on the back side, you have this opening. Well, what I do is I stuff grease in through there. If you have a grease gun that you can use to squirt it in there, that's great too. But that's only one side. So I want to make sure I get all the gears that are inside here. That's where the handle comes in to play. Taking my handle, and all I'm doing is moving it. Now that opens up the other side of the mechanism so that I can get grease on both sides. Although I've already put grease in, it doesn't hurt to add a little bit extra. So you kind of stuff grease on both sides, get it in there really well. And once you think you have a lot of grease or enough grease, put your handle back on and run it through the entire movement. And as you can see, it's going to grease your sprocket. Run it all the way back to the other side, and it'll help to distribute the grease. Then you run it back towards the middle and add more grease. So this way you get the grease on the sprocket. You make sure the internal components are greased. I recommend you do this a couple of times so that you make sure that you get enough grease for the components and that it will operate smoothly after you put this back in. You can, if you wish to, add some grease to the top of the sprocket teeth. I do that just because I figure it's not going to hurt it. Once everything is greased and your components are back to where they need to be and set up, it's simply a matter of just reinstalling it into the door. So let's go back to the reinstallation. Earlier we talked about the vent window and the guide and then the rear guide. So as you look at the door, your rear guide is going to go right over here. And then your vent window goes through the top and then down the guide through there. You do not have to have those pre-installed before you put the window regulator in. You can if you wish to. It's not going to affect your ability to get the window regulator in, but I have been told, and I haven't gotten to this point yet, that when you are reinstalling the window, it's a little bit easier to put the window in and not have the vent glass on, but put that on after you get the window attached to your window regulator unit. Let's go ahead and install the window regulator. Okay, here's your regulator. As you can see, I have these lined back up to go that way, but for the purposes of showing you if you haven't marked it when you initially took it out, let's turn this up this way, and I'll show you what I mean about as far as spinning this when you put it back in again. So let's go and put this in. Now we talked about folding it to get it out. Well, you're basically going to do the same thing. kind of fold it up this way. Slide it in. Kind of folds over a little bit. See, as you fold it over, this clears. This can go all the way in towards the back. Again, as this slides and rotates down, now you're in. Really, really simple. Move it over, and as you move it over, you're going to have to open this up and then slide or rotate that back down. Alright, now I'm in. So what you have to do next, obviously, is just attach the bolts. So let's go ahead and get a couple of bolts into the mechanism and the coil spring area just to hold it in place so that we can attach the rest of it. Hopefully the bolts won't slip and fall on me since my hands are greasy. I think the hardest part's getting the bolts put in without dropping the blasted things. Okay, that one's in. Do one on the opposite side here. Now, you don't want these to be too tight. Back it off a little bit so it's loosened up a little bit. You want it tight enough so that it holds it in place, but you also want it to be able to shift like this. The reason for that is simple, is you've got to line up the other attaching point. So, here's the top that connects to the window. This goes up, and I had spun the mechanism earlier. So, as you see, hopefully you can see it in the video, the holes are not quite lining up properly. So I've got the one on the top, I can get that lined up where I can get a bolt in there, but I can't get any bolts into the other one. This is where, if that unit is not properly greased, it's going to be a hard time for you to spin that. Come in here, we'll spin this. In this case, I'm just spinning it counterclockwise. You can spin it clockwise or counterclockwise, just depends on where you're at. And as I spin this, the holes start to line up. And let's see, is that it? That looks like that's about it. And it may be a little bit of trial and error as you go through this process. You may have to spin it over a couple of times to get things lined up properly. But you see I'm shifting it here, and that's because it's loose through here, which allows me to shift this and get it lined up. Which I do believe this is a proper position to line it up. Yeah, okay. So let me go ahead and get a couple bolts in there. Okay, so I got those bolts in there. I'm still not quite lined up properly. I'm gonna have to spin this a couple of times, but you get the general gist of the idea. Once you have this lined up, all you're gonna do is you're gonna secure your bolts, put the rest of the bolts on, and you're done. It doesn't take a whole lot of fighting, it doesn't take a whole lot of cussing to get this done. It makes it a lot easier. I wish I had known this when I had taken it out the first time. I'm glad I figured it out the second time, and I'm hopeful that this video will help other people who take on this project. And that's all there is to it in installing your window regulator, as well as removing it and getting it cleaned up.